Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Right, Sunday chores out of the way. Time to do something a little bit more interesting, I think. So, right, this week, time to get back to the episode of Scottish Distillery. I think we've been doing a few other weird and wonderful things, so I think it's about time we kind of got back back on track with regards to doing that. So this week we've obviously reached the letter N. Now, not exactly a huge selection of distilleries beginning with the letter N. In fact, I think there's only a couple, and I'd love to have done an episode of the show on Northport, but I think in all the time I've been in the business, I think I've only ever tasted one bottling of Northport, so it's not like something that comes around all of the time, and I certainly wouldn't be able to get my hands on 6 samples, unfortunately. So that kind of only leaves us with one other distillery, the North British Grain Distillery in Edinburgh, or just outside of Edinburgh. Which is not an issue because, as you know, I'm a big fan of grain whisky, and I thought, yeah, I've done a couple of episodes on the show on a couple of the other grain distilleries, so why not North British? So anyway, North British as a distillery has been in production for the entire time of its life. It was founded or the North British Distillery Company was founded in 1885 by someone called Andrew Usher, William Sanderson and John Crabby. 2 years later the distillery was built, it was up and running, and from what I've been reading about it, it was the finances were put together by the trade, so it was kind of almost like an 1800s version of crowdsourcing, I suppose. I guess they obviously, various members of the trade, probably distilleries, things like that, or distillery owners I should say, put money into it, probably bought shares, and then obviously had access to the North British grain. As you know, with sort of most of the, or all of the grain distilleries, they're not exactly pretty little distilleries, should we say. Although part of the distillery, when you look at it, is, I wouldn't even say it's pretty brick buildings. This is sort of like, classic kind of late 1800s brick building, and then you sort of look behind that and you've got all these huge stainless steel holding vats and stuff like that, and it's a real factory, and as I've said before, this is the biggest problem that grain whisky has, that it's viewed as an industrial product because it is made on an industrial scale. I mean, basically, if you look at the early output of the distillery in the early years, well, in actual fact, in their first full year of production, they turned out 3.6 million litres of alcohol. I mean, that's huge. And the production obviously built steadily. It dipped obviously during the war years, but then picked up again after the war and carried on. And in actual fact, the distillery pretty much stayed in the same hands, or the same structure, for well over 100 years. It wasn't until 1993 when the then owners merged with IDV to create a joint venture called Lothian Distillers, which kept the name North British. And they've carried on modernising. I mean, there's a strange thing that apparently in 2002 they sold some of their warehousing site and their bottling plant and the maltings, which really seems a little bit odd when it comes down to it. The fact that sort of the early 2000s weren't exactly sort of a downturn in the whisky industry. I mean, it was the beginning of the upturn in reality, and yet they'd sort of decided to sell off all of that kit. So they now buy in grain, predominantly maize, which is distilled at the distillery. I mean, it's got talking of size. It has 24 washbacks each with a capacity of 200,000 litres, and 14 washbacks that have a capacity of 400,000 litres. So the ton room has an approximate capacity of 10 million litres. I mean, that's huge. You know, then they have 4 huge Kofi stills. Each are continually fed with between 35 and 40,000 litres of wash per hour. So I mean, again, like I said, this is all adding to the misnomer that grain is just an industrial product. I mean, you know, hopefully this tasting will show that, you know, given some serious age in the cask, it does indeed develop into a really interesting spirit. You know, coming back to the distillery and its output, apparently, from what I was reading, it took 100 years for it to produce 1.5 billion litres of alcohol. But 10 years later they'd hit 2 billion, you know, and then apparently another 2, then it got to 2.5 in 2015, so they are really churning it out. The distillery itself, as you probably know, doesn't release any bottlings. All, or pretty much 90% I guess of their production is sold to the trade, whether it's actually aged in casks. They do have warehousing, and they do age there, but I would imagine quite a lot of it is actually sort of tankered out pretty much as it's distilled, and probably sort of filled into casks wherever it's heading for. The spirit itself runs off the still at 94.5%, and then it is placed into reducing vats, where they reduce the ABV to 68.6 before being filled into cask. I'm actually quite surprised that it's that low. I thought it was a lot higher that it was put into cask, when you think about how high the alcohol content is when it comes off the still, and how long grain whisky seems to age for. I mean, 50 years is not a problem for a grain whisky, as we will find out when we get to the 50-odd-year-old grain and the 52-year-old grain. Yeah, I mean, and also the thing is that sort of, you know, if you're talking 50-year-old Macallan, for example, well, you're talking an arm and a leg, aren't you? You're talking 4 figures, quite easily, probably even more, if you're talking sort of, you know, one that's been bottled in days of yore, should we say. But you can still buy a 50-year-old grain whisky for 3 figures quite comfortably, you know, which makes it remarkable value for money. So, anyway, that's enough waffle about the distillery. Like I said, they're not particularly pretty to look at. They're kind of, you know, behemoths, and but you know what they produce is quite interesting. And at the end of the day, you know, the Scotch whisky industry is really built on these you know, big old grain plants, because as we know, you know, single malts only account for such a small percentage of the overall sales of Scotch whisky, the bulk of it, of course, being blended. So if they weren't about, well, there probably wouldn't be much of an industry, would they? So anyway, I think that's enough waffle about that. So it's time to introduce this afternoon's lineup. Right, okay, we're going to kick off with a no age statement bottling. This is bottled by the Boutique Whisky Company. It's their North British Batch 2, bottled at 49.3. I think it was bottled last year, if memory serves me correct. And this is probably, I think this is the first time I've actually used one of their whiskies on the show, so it's probably been long overdue. For those of you that don't know, that Boutique Whisky Company is sort of owned by, well, it's owned by Maverick Drinks. It's their bottling company. Maverick Drinks is part of Atom Supplies, who trade as Master of Malts. So it's, and as you can see from the picture, they're quite into their kind of hoopy, sort of Richard Branson funky guys kind of labelling, which is, I guess some people kind of like that thing, but at the end of the day it doesn't really bother me too much. It's what's in the bottle is more important than what the label looks like. So then we're going to move, like I say, this is a no age statement. I have tasted it before, and I think it's about sort of, it's somewhere in the 20s, but it tastes, well, quite youngish, but we'll obviously get onto that, which is why I'm going to do it first. The second bottling we're going to be looking at is the Douglas Laing Old Particular North British 21-year-old. This was distilled in October of 1994, bottled in July of 2015 at 50.9%. Cask reference, for those of you that like to know these things, is DL10797. So, as you know, both Douglas Laing and Hunter Lang haven't quite got the monopoly on grain whisky bottlings, but they bottle by far more grain than practically any other independent that I've come across. Talking of which, I have a brand spanking new bottle. This is the North British, bottled by Carn in their black gold range. So first fill Oloroso ahoy, as you can see from the colour. This was distilled in 1992, bottled probably about now in actual fact. I mean, it's, you know, hence why there isn't really a proper bottle shot on the entry picture, because it's not in bottle yet and it hasn't hit the trade. So, you know, first view, shall we say. Bottled at 58.3 and like I said, 24 years old. Don't know what the cask number is, so we'll pass on that one, shall we? Right, moving swiftly on, we're moving on to the first of the Hunter Lang bottlings. This is in their Sovereign Grain series, in the small dumpy little bottles. This is a 25-year-old, bottled at 59.7%. It was distilled in September of 1989 and bottled in February of last year. So, interesting to see what that's about. I don't know if you've noticed this, but with grain whiskies, 21 is quite young in grain whisky terms, and a lot of them seem to be being bottled around about between 24, 27 years old. There doesn't seem to be anything in the 30s. It's sort of like you go from 20 something to 50. You know, it's just unusual. And talking of 50s, we will be looking at two that are 50 and 50 plus. The first is again in the Hunter Lang Sovereign series. This was a slightly older bottle, which was bottled in the tall round bottles, and this was distilled in, if I can find my notes, and I've lost them, 1962. It's a little bit before I was born. Bottled in August of 2013 at 59.7. See what I mean about grain? Nearly 60% and 50 years old. I mean, you know, that's lost, what, a handful of percent in alcohol. So I mean, it was either a very, very warm cask area of where it was matured, or that was a damn tight cask. That's all I can say. For those of you that like to know, the cask reference is HL9930. And finally, the last of the two Douglas Laing. This was bottled in their Director's Cut range. It is 52 years old, bottled at 41.1%. That's where you would expect a grain to be at 52 years old. You'd expect it to sort of, like, you know, drop down to that kind of level. Again, this was distilled in 1962, May 1962, and bottled in June of 2014. Cask reference DL10356. So hopefully this will be an interesting taste and give you an idea of how North British ages, although it would have been nice to have had a 30-odd-year-old North British, just to kind of, you know, so that the jump between 25 and 50 wasn't quite so big. But unfortunately, like I said, they don't seem to bottle them at that age, and I ain't got a sample, so we'll just have to make do with what we've got. So, without more ado, let's kick off with the boutique whisky one then. Right, okay, so let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Now it's quite neutral. I mean, it smells young grain. I mean, I had a look on the website, and obviously now that boutique whisky company have started putting on age statements, but prior to that they weren't. And kind of tried to estimate from the retail price of it, the sort of age, and I'm guessing this is going to be somewhere in the 20s. It'll probably turn out to be a lot older in actual fact, but it certainly doesn't seem that. It's got that crisp, fresh, almost kind of barleyed kind of character, which is interesting. There's a little bit of vanilla. It's got a little bit of that sort of dried, almost rummy-like fruit. Yeah, I mean, it could do with a little bit more oak, a little bit more sweetness possibly, but it certainly shows up how, in actual fact, probably, maybe it doesn't, because the grain has got a nice sweetness to it, which is unusual. Normally, grain tends to be more grainy, you know, rather than having that kind of almost barleyed sort of sweetness. But it's a bit simple, and that's again an issue with grain whiskies when they're very young. Like I said, 21 is probably still a bit young by grain standards, because it just needs some oak character really, just to give it some other dimension, and it needs time to oxidise and develop those kind of dried fruit character. It's got a pleasant sort of citric, lemony kind of note. Yeah, I mean, it's not a bad grain. Palate. Really full, chewy. Now I'm getting more oak, sort of nuts, coconut, vanilla, really quite full, little bit of almost chocolatey spice coming through right on the finish. It's got almost a sort of a chili-like hotness to it, which is, you know, really nice. A bit of dried fruit, not hugely complex, but certainly it's got some lovely depth to it. It's got some length. Whether it's worth the price tag or not, of course, is debatable, but you know, you would expect, you know, a 21-year-old grain to probably be in around about the sort of 65 to sort of £70 mark, which is actually pretty good value for a 21-year-old spirit. By the time they get to their sort of mid-20s, 25, 27, you're looking at probably a shade under £100, which again for a 25-year-old whiskey, you know, is still remarkably good value. Hopefully by the time we get to that, I will show you why they're remarkably good value. So anyway, as a starter, I don't think that was too shabby, shall we say. Okay, so moving on to the Douglas Laing 21-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Now this is more kind of classic young grain, slightly high toned, slightly grainy. It's got a little bit of dried fruit sweetness. It's got a little bit of that sort of slightly robust, almost barley kind of character that the first whiskey we tasted had. Again, not exactly a huge amount of oak kind of coming through. There's a little bit of vanilla in the background. It's a little bit sharper, like I said, a little bit crisper, a little bit more grainy, a little bit more as you would expect, but still, like I said, showing a little bit of the fullness that the previous one had. Palate. Very pleasant. Again, we're not talking mega complexity here. A bit more oak of the toffee variety rather than the coconutty kind of variety that the previous one had. So probably guessing at refill American oak with regards to this particular bottling. I know Hunter Laing and Douglas Laing tend to sort of favour the use of or refill American hoggies and things like that. So a little bit of dried fruit, a little bit of graininess, possibly not quite so full, more classically grain in inverted commas, pleasant length, and again, yeah, nice, nice bottling. Can't argue with that. I mean, certainly it's got a bit of depth to it. I say not hugely complex, but then you wouldn't expect a grain at 21 to be particularly complex. So so yeah, another pleasant one, I think. Right, moving on to the Carn more. Let's see what the nose gives us on this one, shall we? Big sherry. Huge sherry, absolutely monstrous sherry, really kind of gritty, very slightly herbal, coffeed, raw, but not in an unpleasant kind of manner. And with a little bit of time, some of the dried fruit character of the grain whisky is coming through. Actually, it's not too badly balanced, I don't think. I'm getting a bit of bitter chocolate. It's certainly, if you need to love your sherry monsters if you're going to enjoy this one. But in saying that, that's the thing about grain whisky. It does seem to sort of, handle sherry casks particularly well, and that's because it has that grainy intensity. People might think you're sort of talking daft when you say grain whisky has graininess to it, but it does. Well, certainly to me it certainly does, and it has that sort of grainy, almost verging on the spice kind of character. I mean, for those of you that are not that well versed, shall we say, in grain whisky, the closest I could come to it would be sort of maybe Canadian. That has a sort of, often tends, to me anyway, to have a kind of grainy kind of character. Or Irish pot still, again, that has a very grainy kind of character. And I'm guessing part of that is not obviously only down to the still, but obviously the malting process. Yeah, I mean, this is a big old sherry beastie, as they say. It's got a little bit of sweet dried fruit coming out now, slightly pruny. It's got a nice balance between the sort of the dried sherry fruit and the dried fruit of the spirit. Although, yeah, the sherry is slightly more in the ascendancy, shall we say. About. Oh, that's got a bitter finish. Oh, that's a lot of wood. That's got a lovely aftertaste, that lovely dried sherry fruit aftertaste. A little bit of walnuts, prune, plum, sweet coffee, bitter chocolate. It's got so much going for it. Little bit of graininess coming through as well. Really well balanced for a sherry monster, it has to be said. Very long, but the grain keeps that finish really fresh, and although there's a little bit of treacle kind of coming through, it doesn't ever sort of get out of hand with regards to that. The grain just has that verve and that intensity to balance that out, and it finishes quite fresh, almost citric, with that sort of intense grainy kind of character. So yeah, that's an impressive bottling, I have to say. And for someone that's not the world's biggest fan of sherry monsters, that's praise, I think. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 25. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? A lot more oak, as I was going to expect. But we're not talking mountains of oak, we're talking sort of quite sweet vanilla, little bit of toffee, touch of dried fruit underneath, that sort of slightly rummy dried fruit, sweet spice. And this is the thing, obviously, as grain whisky spends so much time in the cask, it's going to pick up the cask notes. And getting the balance between oak and spirit obviously is a lot trickier when it comes to grain whisky, because of the inherent lightness of character. Quite oily, a little bit of marzipan, but again it's got a freshness to it, and you certainly wouldn't have, well, unless you sort of like, you know, quite well versed in grain whiskies, you would probably be hard pressed to sort of say this was 25 years old. I mean, certainly if you were nosing a 25-year-old malt whisky, for example, you know, it would be showing a lot more maturity than what this is. But this is really quite nice. Again, you've got to like American oak, so which I do. So yeah, palate. Oh, that's gorgeously soft. For something bottled at close to 60%, the alcohol is so nicely integrated. It gives it a little bit of bite on the finish, kind of emphasising the sort of the grainy spiciness of the spirit. Again, there's some lovely oak, some toffee, some caramel, a little bit of almost kind of toasted coconut, certainly toasty oak. But again, that lovely vibrant finish, with that sort of classic kind of grain finish. That is absolutely fantastic. I love that. That is really nice, and it's just a good age for, you know, it's probably where grain whisky should start to be bottled. 25, 27 seems to be sort of like a nice age, because it's, you know, got some complexity from the oak. It still has some inherent youthfulness in inverted commas, and generally got a nice kind of bite to it. So yeah, nice. Right, so moving on to the first of our 1962s. Let's see what the nose gives us on the 50-year-old then, shall we? Now that is nice. More, actually not as much oak as you might expect. It's got quite a tannic oakiness, but there's sort of lots and lots of dried oxidised fruit with that slightly sort of rummy kind of character, probably more rummy in actual fact. And like I've said in the past, you know, old grains tend to either move in one or two directions. They'll either sort of develop this rum-like kind of oxidised character, or they'll develop a sort of a cognac-y kind of, or armagnac-y kind of rancio. This is certainly in the rum camp. It's got quite a lightness, a little herbal note kind of coming through. Like I said, not as much oak as you might have expected. Certainly there's less oak on the nose on this particular one as there was on the 25, but it's got a little bit of nuttiness, a little bit of coconut. Quite a lot of coconut coming through now, actually sort of desiccated coconut. A little bit of white chocolate, a little bit of caramel, no not caramel, toffee. Light, very light toffee, sort of butter toffee. Yeah, the oak is now starting to develop as it's spending some time in the glass, but also so is the dried fruit notes. They're really starting to come through strongly now. This is very bold, really nice, really intense, but it has a sort of subtlety to it as well, and an elegance, which is the thing. There's none of your kind of fainty off notes and sort of rough industrial notes and things like that. Most grain whiskies I tend to come across have a real elegance to them, aside from the ones that have been aged in sulphurous sherry casks, that is, but you know, thankfully they're few and far between. Palate. quite dry finish, quite tannic, but not in a sort of an overt style. There's some nice dried fruit. There's a little bit of that sort of grippy, spicy, grainy finish. Touch of dried fruits, really, really long. The dried fruits now all kind of coming back now. Once you've kind of got the alcohol and the grippy tannin out of the way, the dried fruit is just lingering. There's a little bit of white chocolate, a little bit of dark spice. That is absolutely gorgeous. That sort of lovely dried fruit character is just going and going and going. That is just a lovely mouthful. Yeah, okay, it ain't going to be cheap. I mean, I can't remember for the life of me how much that would have retailed for, but like I said, certainly a damn sight less than a 50-year-old Macallan, shall we say. And to be honest with you, I think I'd rather have this than a 50-year-old Macallan. Well, yeah, actually I probably would, to be bluntly honest with you, but that's me, isn't it? And finally, the second of the 1962s. This one, obviously, like I said, 52 years old, so let's see what the nose gives us. Oh, that is absolutely gorgeous. That's old rum. Quite deep, almost molassy-like dried fruits, but again, it's got a lovely lightness to it. Again, a crisp, grainy note, a subtle oak, almost kind of old violets, old marzipan. Really complex. It's got a really great rancio. Like I said, it's kind of almost sort of getting a little bit cognac-y now. In actual fact, it's kind of started off sort of in that rum-like kind of dried fruit, but now it's kind of changing. It's getting a little bit more taut, a little bit more cognac-y. Yeah, that's got some lovely old vanillins. Almost a slight kind of saltiness as well, which is intriguing. But oh, that's got some maturity. You can really smell the dusty oak, and it's just absolutely sublimely balanced. Absolutely gorgeous. Palate. Oh, God, that's good. Just like an old cognac, sort of elegant, dusty, mature. It's even got some sort of oxidized kind of apricot fruit, a little bit of spice on the end, but really succulent, lovely juicy dried fruits. Little bit of oak, a little bit of tannin coming through, but not a great deal. A little bit of vanilla, all very subtle, very elegant. You know, just like a great cognac should be. You know, elegant and long. God, that is good. That really is absolutely stunning. Yeah, again, like I said, that probably wasn't cheap at all, but oh, that was good. Right, okay, so let's sum this little tasting up. Like I said, it would have been nice to have had a 30-year-old to kind of like, you know, just bridge the gap between the 25 and the 50, but, you know, I can only work with what I've got. So, anyway, great tasting, I think, really interesting. Again, just sort of shows you how amazingly well grained whiskey can age. Because of their production process, the continuous still, doesn't seem to have quite the sort of, doesn't give such a character, a full spirit as obviously pot still distillation does. Although obviously some are lighter than others. Invergordon and Canvas can be sort of relatively lighter in style than say something like Port Dundas, and this one kind of North British has a sort of, appears to have a fairly robust, almost sweet kind of character when it's young, but obviously by the time you know, you've got to sort of 25, sort of 50 years old, the emphasis kind of shifts more towards the sort of like the dried fruits and the oak. Although, like I said, these were all very, very subtle, relatively speaking, on the oak content. Unlike Invergordon, which tends to be a bit of a monster when it comes to oak. I don't know whether that's just because they tend to use maybe more first fill casks or what, but anyway. So yeah, really, really interesting tasting. Boutique Whisky Company bottling, certainly pleasant. Comes across like a relatively young grain, but I think it's probably older than what it tastes like. Certainly the Douglas Laing 21 tasted like a 21-year-old grain. Nice depth, not a huge amount of complexity, but again, it's relatively affordable. You know, if you're looking to get into grain whiskies, that's probably a good starting point as any. The Carn, well, yeah, it's a sherry monster. But again, like I said, sherry and grain does seem to sort of work relatively well. I mean, even in first fill Oloroso, it certainly, you know, stood up to all that sort of tannic sherry wood character. 25-year-old, I mean, that was really nice. I mean, that was starting to develop some maturity, starting to show how the grains start to age, and, you know, really quite impressive. And the two 50-year-olds, well, you know, not a huge amount actually quality-wise to choose between them. Maybe the 52-year-old slightly peaks the 50-year-old, but both were absolutely fantastic, and like I said, a fraction of the money that you would pay for a 50-year-old malt whisky. So in terms of value for money, absolutely incredible. So there you have it. That's this week's episode of the show. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it will, you know, you'll get the grain bug, shall we say, and try out a few of these grain whiskies that are knocking about. Probably avoid things like the Hay Club, shall we say, but certainly, you know, look at you know, Douglas Laing, look at Hunter Laing. You know, there are all the other independents often tend to bottle the occasional grain, but there you go. Anyway, so that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. So all that's left to say is good afternoon and good dram.